It's my pleasure to introduce Greg Walton. He's the Michael Foreman University Fellow and Associate Professor of Psychology at Stanford University. He earned his PhD from Yale University in Psychology, and his research examines the nature of self and identity, often in the context of academic motivation and achievement. He works on how social factors are relevant to student motivation, as well as stereotype threat, and how group differences can result in differences in academic achievement. Greg is very well known in the educational research and inclusive classroom fields, and we're thrilled to have him visiting today to talk about questions of belonging, their implications of performance, merit, and intervention. Please join me in welcoming Greg Walton.
Pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you today and to share some of the work really that comes from the community of scholars who I'm part of in psychology and related fields. And this work really begins at a social psychological level, and what that means is that we begin by thinking about how the world appears to people who have different perspectives or experiences on that world. There's not a generic perspective, but the perspective from a place, from an identity often. And so we can begin with images like this, where we think about what does it feel like to sit in the classroom, in the third row of a classroom, and look out towards the instructor, or what does it feel like in a work environment to sit at a desk in a small work group at a company maybe that you've joined. And when people are in these circumstances, there are certain kinds of questions that often readily come to mind. And these are psychological questions that often take a form of a kind of a worry about what that place might be like. These questions include things like, do I belong? Is this a place in which I'll be valued and included? If things are difficult, if I have trouble here, if something goes badly, does that maybe mean that I don't belong? Or maybe does that even mean that people like me don't belong? People ask questions like, can I do it? If I struggle, if I fail on something, if I work hard on something and don't do well in it, does that mean I'm dumb? Does that mean I can't do it? Does that mean people like me can't do it? Or questions about mattering. If the work is frustrating and tedious sometimes, does that mean it's not worth it? Is there a reason to do it, to engage with it? And one of the things that's just been so exciting in psychology in the last number of years is that as we've come to understand these implicit questions that people are often asking as they come into demanding school and work settings better and more clearly, we've been able to construct experiences for people that help them answer these questions in more productive ways, and that can really launch lasting gains in people's experiences, improvements in achievement and well-being that last months and years, which I'll talk about some later. I want to emphasize that these questions are often loaded because of the sociocultural history of our society. People come into settings with an identity, and that identity has meaning in the history of our society, the history of our institutions, and the perspective that people then have on those spaces. So these perspectives then are rooted in the lived experiences and the identities that we all bring to school and work environments. And you can see this history sort of very, very vividly in many, many ways. This is just one example. This is the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. And you can imagine the sort of acute feeling of disrespect and exclusion that a woman might feel as she walks through this parade of segregationists. In many ways, our education systems have a legacy of exclusion that we are continuing to deal with and address today. So when people then come into these settings, those contexts and that history raises these questions for people. There's questions that people have on the table, on their minds, even if they're maybe not always fully aware of them, that they're trying to answer as they're coming into settings. At a high level, one way to frame this question is, can people like me belong and succeed here? Is this a place where people like me can belong and succeed? And then how we construct settings helps people answer those questions, either positively or negatively, and those answers become really consequential. So people then look to cues in context, sometimes really overt, obvious cues, but also often very subtle kinds of cues to figure out the answers to these pressing questions, to figure out whether this is a space where they really should invest themselves and their efforts, whether those efforts are likely to pay off. So the first part of what I want to share with you today is work that starts to understand these cues, that starts to sort of reveal the kind of hidden meanings that exist in settings that people draw inferences from to suss out whether they're going to belong and be able to succeed there. Those of you who are in the back, there's plenty of seats up here, and I can just pause for you guys to be able to sit down. I don't want to be exclusive. Okay, so a very basic cue that people often have available to them as they look out at a new space is a cue of representation. Are there people like me there? And the tennis great Arthur Ashe said famously, like many other blacks, when I find myself in a new public situation, I'll count. And then he said, I'll always count. I'll always count. And if you imagine a physics conference, and you imagine not being a white-haired, white man looking at the kind of people who are in that environment, that underrepresentation of people who look like you, who have your age or your gender or your race, ethnicity, or other kinds of salient features of your background that might be important parts of who you are, it provokes lots of questions like, why aren't there people like me here? Why do there continue to be the underrepresentation of people like me in this environment? What does that mean for what my experience might be like? This was a boardroom at a San Francisco professional association that is a partner, actually, that we collaborate with in some work. And these are the past presidents of this association. They've adorned this main conference room that they have in their downtown San Francisco building with all of these images. And as you watch them go by, there was one who wasn't a non-white man. You can see that representation of the history on the wall, a representation that the organization has chosen to continue to depict. And it raises, again, the same question: why is it like this here? Why does it continue to be like that? You can see there is some improvement later, but that the overall representation is one of a very white male space. So a good friend and collaborator, Mary Murphy, who got her PhD at Stanford, is now a professor at Indiana, did early work examining what happens when you expose young students, undergraduate students who are interested in math, science, and engineering to a video that represents a math, science, and engineering conference that either is or isn't diverse. So what she did is she had a balanced video that depicted equal numbers of men and women, or she had an unbalanced video that had 3 men for every woman. So this is a 2x2 design. If you have men and women who are interested in math, science, and engineering, look at either of these videos. And the theory here was that when you have that unbalanced video, that might be a cue of a kind of a threat to the identity of women in that context. Come on in. We have some seats up here if you'd like to sit. So the first thing that Mary looked at is a measure of vigilance, and this was a memory measure. So she asked people how much, she asked people about details of the video that had been presented that were irrelevant to any math, science, engineering content, and just looked to see how much people were really engrossed in and paying attention to and remembering these irrelevant things. What she finds is that in the unbalanced video condition, women are vigilant and attending to all of these background features of the video, much more so than men, and that's mitigated in the balanced video condition. Just to put this in perspective, like imagine that you're actually going to a conference, so you're a physicist and you're going to a physics conference, and you're attending to all the different kinds of background things that are happening in that space. Are you going to be able to pay attention to the talks as well as you could have otherwise? Are you going to be able to really engage with the poster session, for example, and have a conversation about the actual substance of that work? That's a cost. That vigilance is a direct cost to a person's ability to really do what they're trying to do at the conference from a professional or a learning perspective. Mary also looked at a physiological measure of vigilance. This was the cardiovascular reactivity. It's things like how fast their hearts are beating, and the skin conductance, how much they're sweating on their fingers. And she showed the same kind of pattern where women who are watching this unbalanced video show this heightened cardiovascular response. They don't do that in response to the balanced video. I want to depart slightly and give a little bit of an aside here. I once had the opportunity to present this to a major STEM department at Stanford. And this was a department faculty meeting. It was a large faculty. I had been invited by the chair, who was a woman. There was literally one other woman in the room. And she was in the back, and there were about 40 men, all faculty, in the room. And I got to hear, I thought this would be a good place to start. And then the second woman in the room from the back said, well, of course they're sweating more. They just saw a bunch of men. And I was like, you're making the sexist joke? Like, let's cut this talk and talk about why you felt the need to make the sexist joke in response to that video. Like, what is the climate that you're experiencing here that made you feel like you needed to say that? And I didn't want to do that, right? I didn't want to put the spotlight on her. I didn't know how to handle it right in the moment. But I think these things are very live for people, especially when people are going into settings where they're so deeply underrepresented. Now, Mary, to come back to our primary story here, Mary also just asked people, to what extent do you think you'd belong here? And unsurprisingly, women anticipate that they would belong less in the male-dominated conference context. Now, that's one cue. That's the people in the space. But there are many other kinds of cues that also matter. Another scholar, Submaterial, who is at Washington, has looked at static cues, physical things in spaces that have identity-tied sort of meanings to people. She did this work in the basement of the Gates Computer Science building at Stanford. She took over a small room and she adorned it either in a way that represented a kind of geeky, masculine representation. It had a Star Trek poster, sci-fi books, Coke cans, or she replaced those physical artifacts with neutral things like a nature poster, neutral books, and water bottles. And what she had learned through her pilot testing was that these things on the left, the stereotypical things, were common within these computer science spaces, and they seem to signal a kind of geeky masculine representation of the field. There's still some seats up here in the front if folks are needing places to sit. You're most welcome to come. So the interest that Sepna had was to ask, if you are just completing a survey about your interest in computer science as an undergraduate, would you report a different level of interest in these two contexts? And what she found is that in the stereotypical room, women reported less interest in pursuing computer science than men, and that actually reversed in the non-stereotypical context, as though these women who are interested in technical fields are thirsty for an opportunity to be able to engage with them without having to conform to this kind of geeky masculine representation. Now, those are relatively static things that are kind of easy to quantify and measure. Other work has started to look at the kinds of interactions that people have in settings, the inferences that people draw from those interactions, and the kinds of beliefs that exist in settings that start to shape the ways in which people interact with each other. And I want to show this first example, which comes from a researcher named Christine Lobel, who is at Waterloo. And what Christine did was to stage interactions between men and women in engineering at Waterloo, which is a leading technical university in Canada. She did that first by, she gave people an engineering news story and had them discuss it. And she did it first by asking people to complete a subtle measure of sexism. This was a measure where people completed sentences. Some of the sentences began in kind of traditional gender role congruent ways, like Jenny went home to cook dinner. And the participant's job is to complete the sentence. And so if a participant completed the sentence in a gender role way, like for her husband, that would count as more sexist. If they completed it in another way, like because she'd been eating out a lot lately, that would be counted as not sexist. So men and women both did this, and then men and women who are all in engineering had an interaction about this engineering news story. And then they later took a math test. And the first thing that Christine found was that the patterns of interaction varied as a function of the man's level of sexism. So the more sexist men, the interactions that involved the more sexist men, they sat with a more open posture, they sat closer, they looked at the woman's body more, and they were rated as more dominant and confident. I want to try to just show you what that looks like a little bit. Would you mind coming up? Christine later, by the way, told me as a teacher that she felt she was reliving her dissertation because a male student was treating her this way. So just, yeah. So it's not, but it's really not like, it's not, it's really, it's kind of like this, okay? No, yeah, as opposed to like this. So it's not offensive. Nobody called it sexual harassment. It's not as you can sort of read that and think it's more extreme, but it's really much more kind of commonplace. But what it does do is it creates a kind of gendered nature to the interaction. Like the two people are now interacting as man and woman, and in this somewhat sexualized way, rather than as just peers interacting around a common interest. In fact, just to illustrate how subtle this is, when women were asked later how much they liked the man, they like the dominant and sexist man more. Okay? But it had a cost. So here is women's math performance, and you can see that their math performance does not vary as a function of their own level of sexism, but when they interact with the more sexist man, they start to score much less well on the math test. They experienced a kind of threat to their identity that was not compatible with doing well in math. A later study, Christine used trained actors, people trained to act in the sexist or the non-sexist way, to really isolate the causal effect of that behavior on the part of men. She found that this had no effect on women's performance on an English test, a test that wasn't inside of the stereotype, but it really did have a detrimental effect on their math performance. Okay. Now, Will Hall, who is now at Brock University in Canada, has taken this to understand the experiences that people have in work settings, including day-to-day kinds of interactions. And what he did was to ask professional engineers to complete daily surveys reporting how much identity threat they felt each day, like to what extent did you feel really aware of your gender, and also to report about the kinds of interactions that they had each day. So the first finding is that women overall report higher levels of identity threat. Women, these female professional engineers, report higher overall levels of identity threat than men. But that was especially the case when when a salient conversation they'd had that day was with a man and negative. If they had the same kind of conversation with a woman, it didn't produce that heightened level of identity threat. And that identity threat, at least correlationally, was predictive of bad things. It predicted greater levels of burnout. So people reported feeling more burnt out at the end of the day if they'd had this negative interaction with a man that had made them feel that their gender identity was on the line. Okay, in work settings, one of the things that I think is particularly important is the extent to which you can contribute to the joint kind of product that the organization is trying to produce. In school, we organize school around learning, but we organize work around producing and contributing, and we want to be parts of, when we are at work, we want to be parts of that community of people who's coming together to create the work product. A graduate student at Stanford, Greg Muragishi, has explored this in partnership with a large Silicon Valley company, a tech company, where people reported on the degree to which they felt like they belonged at the company overall, but they also reported the extent to which they anticipated that they would belong in response to 3 different scenarios that could happen at work. One of the scenarios was a neutral scenario. You're on a new team. There's a program that's idiosyncratic. You have a manager. There's no real content there. A second scenario was negative, and it's negative in particular in the way that it compromises your ability to actually contribute to the joint work process. So You have an idea, but it's not heard, you're interrupted, but later your manager, Evan, basically takes your idea, claims it for himself, and implements it. Okay, so you're like not able to actually contribute and be credited for that contribution within the small group work of the team. And then there's a positive scenario where Evan listens, you go back and forth to work it out, and you're able to implement it. Now, what Greg finds is that if you just look overall at people's sense of belonging at the company, women are reporting lower belonging than men. The effect size is about 1/5 of a standard deviation. If you look at people's responses to that neutral scenario, where they're just anticipating what this work environment might be like, you see, in fact, a slightly larger effect. Women are coming into that scenario having anticipated what it might be like based on their prior experiences and anticipating less belonging. In the negative scenario, everybody goes down. Everybody finds that not positive. But the gender gap, if anything, is larger. It's most not positive for women because it's compromising their ability to contribute, which is a sort of a sore point. What's most interesting then is that in the positive condition, not only does everybody go up, but women go up the most. In fact, the gender difference just barely reverses. So it's not that women are looking out at this company and have a kind of fixed view that they're not going to belong. They're really attentive to and responding to cues, including the interaction cues that allow them to contribute to that setting. It really emphasizes the value of creating spaces where people really are able to contribute, and people from all backgrounds really are able to contribute for supporting something like belonging. Now, what is it that leads people to behave in different ways towards each other in settings? Well, one factor are the kinds of beliefs that people have. And this is a now well-known figure from Sarah Jane Leslie, showing that the degree to which people in a field endorse the view that it takes a genius to succeed in the field strongly predicts the representation of women in those fields. So this was a survey of 1,800 faculty, postdocs, and grad students who answered questions like this. Being a top scholar of this field requires a special aptitude that just can't be taught. And you can see in both STEM and non-STEM fields, there's this strong negative relationship. The more people think it takes a genius, the fewer women there are in those settings. Now, why this is a correlational pattern? Why might that arise? One way that might arise, and this is work from Catherine Good and Anita Rattan, is that in conjunction with negative stereotypes, it can create a threat to belonging for women. So working in a calculus class, Good and Rattan asked the question, do people perceive stereotypes in that calculus class? Do they think that women are not as good as men at calculus? And do they perceive that people in that environment think that intelligence is fixed, that some people have it and other people don't? And when those two things come together, for women, they lead them to feel like they don't belong, and that leads them to have lower intentions to pursue math in the future. In other more recent work, Elizabeth Canning, who's a new professor now at Washington State, asked the question about professors' beliefs. So the prior work was about what people are perceiving of the environment, but here we're going to actually assess professors' beliefs. And Elizabeth surveyed STEM faculty at a large R1 public university in the Midwest and asked them questions about their endorsement of a fixed mindset of intelligence. Like, to be honest, students have a certain amount of intelligence, they can't really do much to change it. And then she linked that data with professor-level student outcomes within their courses, students' grades, and students' course evaluations. And what she finds is that professors who endorse a fixed mindset produce racial gaps in achievement that are approximately twice as large as the professors who endorse the growth mindset. You can see that for both white Asian students and URM students do better in the pedagogical environments created by faculty who endorse the growth mindset. There's a main effect here, but that effect is also particularly large for the groups that are at risk of the negative stereotype. Yeah, shoot. Underrepresented minorities. So that would be, in this case, Black, Latinx, Native American. And why was that? Well, she went further to look at the course evaluation data and found there are these large, robust differences in the ways that students were experiencing these STEM environments. So how much did your instructor motivate you to do your best work? How much did the instructor emphasize learning and development? Would you recommend the course, this course for this instructor? And how much time did the course require? You can see that there's no difference in the amount of time that people are reporting, but the environment is very different. The instructor is motivating them more, the instructor is emphasizing learning and development more, and then at the end of the day, they endorse the course as a better learning experience for other students in the future. Okay, so that kind of work suggests that one kind of thing that we can do to improve outcomes for people, make our learning environments both better and more equitable, is to attend to and change the cues that exist in settings that predictably lead people, and predictably lead people from backgrounds that have been disadvantaged to feel like they don't belong. But they go beyond just the notion of cue, and I think that in some sense the word culture is better. That is, to create cultures in which people are genuinely focused on learning and development, genuinely believe that all people can learn and develop, communicate that and support that at every step in a pedagogical context. But the story's not going to stop there, because it's also the case that many everyday experiences are ambiguous. We saw that in the study of the large tech company, when people were just presented with a very neutral description of a work group with no real content in it, even then women anticipated that they would belong less in that work group than men. So the world isn't comprised of overt cues like this, which is an odd thing to read to your 4-year-old when she's chosen it from the library. No girls allowed. Instead, often what we're trying to do is to decode and make sense of things that are really fundamentally ambiguous, like whether or not we're going to be able to belong in a setting. And when that's the case, people go through sort of elaborate kind of social cognitive efforts to kind of construct whether or not they're going to belong in this setting from cues that might be very subtle. So here is our former First Lady in her photograph, her yearbook photograph from Princeton, where she graduated as an undergraduate. And several years ago, while she was in the White House, she spoke to a group of college leaders and described her own experience in the first days coming to Princeton. She said, when I first arrived at school as a first-gen college student, I didn't know anyone on campus except my brother. I didn't know how to pick the right classes or find the right building. I didn't even bring the right size sheet to my dorm room bed. I didn't realize those beds were so long, so I was a little overwhelmed and a little isolated. I think this is incredibly powerful, because here she is at the time, perhaps the most widely admired and respected woman in America. She's been professionally successful for decades. It's decades since she was an undergraduate at Princeton. And what it is that she's recalling is not some highly sort of salient, overt kind of experience. What she's recalling is that she didn't have the right size sheets for her dorm room bed. And the reason that carried so much weight to her, though, was because it signaled to her that maybe she, as an African-American student, maybe she, as a first-generation student, like if she can't even get the sheets right, how can she ever figure out Princeton? How could she ever belong at Princeton? And so it carried that meaning for her, it carried that weight for her, such that she can recall it decades later as the First Lady of the United States in that incredible position that she was in. So people sometimes are really looking, they're really trying to figure this out, so they're really looking out at the world and trying to make sense of things. Jeff Cohen and I developed the term belonging uncertainty to try to describe this. And the idea is that when people come into settings where their group is disadvantaged, they can be sort of persistently uncertain about whether they belong. They can have that question on their minds pervasively. And that question can shape how they make sense of experiences in the world, like the fact that she didn't have the right sheets for her dorm room bed. And that implies a different kind of remedy, not just changing the cues that exist in the world that present to a person, but also trying to address how the person is making sense of the worlds that they're going into. And it leads us to the question of, can we construct experiences in school and work that help people themselves answer the question of belonging that they have more adaptively? So the social belonging intervention is an approach to try to do this. And what it tries to do is it tries to change people's representation of belonging from a fixed quality to a process. To get people out of a kind of yes-no mindset where they look out at the world and ask, do I belong or not? Does this event mean I belong, or does this event mean I don't belong? and instead into a process mindset where they understand that developing your belonging takes time and effort in a space, and to ask themselves the question, how can I develop that belonging? How can I find my community? How can I find the spaces in this environment that I'll belong to that will be a positive place for me? The intervention is delivered through stories and what we call saying is believing exercises. So people hear stories from older students that describe the truth that everybody worries in one way or another about whether they belong at first in a new school, and that can get better with time, and it illustrates the varieties of ways in which that can get better with time. It's an active experience, so people are then asked, how is this true for you, or how do you anticipate this can be true for you? Write a letter, prepare a speech for new students who are coming in next year who could benefit from your experience, learning about your experience. In the original trial, which was conducted with Black and white students at a highly selective school on the East Coast, we delivered the intervention in the second semester of students' first year of college, one-on-one. And we then tracked students' grades over the next 3 years. And what you can see here is that for Black students in the control condition, there's essentially a kind of flat line in their term-by-term GPA. There's no real growth over that 3-year period, which is really concerning, right? They're taking classes with students from all class years. White students are showing sort of slow growth over time in both conditions. But the 1-hour exercise in the first year for those who received the treatment produced this term-by-term increase in achievement over time, as though over time they're acquiring more resources, more psychological resources, more social resources that help them succeed in a demanding academic environment. In total, this reduced the achievement gap between Black and white students over 3 years by half. That effect got larger with time. It's a reduction of 80% in the senior year because the effect is really on the trajectory of students' experiences over time. It also improved students' health and their well-being, their happiness at the end of college. Belonging is such a central thing that when we can address it effectively, it has reverberating benefits for ourselves and our lives. And here's a bit about how it works. This is from a daily diary report a student gave us in the first week after the intervention, back in her first year. She said, everyone's going out without me, and they didn't consider me making their plans. At times like this, I feel like I don't belong here and that I'm alienated. When we looked very closely, we saw there was no difference by race and no difference by condition in the first part of this sentiment. The kinds of daily trials and tribulations that we go through in the first year of college or in many other sort of challenging academic environments, that was the kind of thing that people went through, that people experienced. But what the intervention did was it eliminated this second part of the sentiment. It robbed that negative event from the negative global meaning that it had. The event was still negative, but it no longer led people to infer that maybe they didn't belong in that environment. And statistically, that change in how people made sense of their experiences mediated the 3-year gain in GPA. Now, we've since tracked these participants much longer into their adult lives, and we surveyed people 7 to 9 years after the original intervention with an 87% retention rate. And one of the things that we found here was that if you look at major indices of adult outcomes, African American students are reporting being more successful and more satisfied in their careers in the treatment condition than in the control condition as a function of the original 1-hour intervention in their first year of college. They're also reporting being happier and being more satisfied in their lives. How could that possibly have happened? How could a 1-hour experience back in the first year of college really change the trajectory, the life trajectories of people? And one of the things we found was that it really wasn't about the improvement in GPA. It wasn't, GPA for African American students in the sample was not strongly predictive of those life outcomes. Instead, it really seemed to have to do with the kinds of networks of relationships that people were better able to enter into in college that persisted after college, what we called mentorship. So when we look among our African American participants and we ask them simply, did you have an academic mentor in college? That nearly doubles with treatment. And we asked them, did this mentorship continue after college? And just 4% of those in the control condition said that they had mentorship that continued after college, and the treatment brought that up to 37%. So what you have here is a psychological process, a worry about belonging that comes from the racist history of our society that's reasonable for students to have as they come into a selective and predominantly white institution. The intervention addresses that worry, it clears that out in such a way that people are able to build relationships with others in that academic environment for lasting success. Yeah. They're mostly faculty, but we let students define that themselves. We do know who they were, and for the most part they were faculty, but they were not exclusively faculty. But we gave that definition to them and let them decide. Okay, and this mediates the long-term gains in both career success and life satisfaction. Okay, so here's an illustration of this. So this was a person with a control condition who says, I wouldn't say I received any mentorship, not for lack of interest in professors, but I didn't really seek it. Here's the treatment condition. My first semester of my freshman year was very difficult. I was struggling academically, didn't feel like I fit in. I was unhappy with my major. I began to spend more time speaking with my freshman counselor. We really bonded, and she helped me realize I did belong at this school. Thanks to her, I was better able to connect with my peers and perform better academically. We've kept in touch ever since. You know, for many people in challenging academic environments, it's these mentor relationships, these often informal kinds of relationships that become really important and help sustain people and improve their trajectories as they move through our systems and into other contexts and into the working world. One way to think about this is through this metaphor. That is that like clay, the meanings that we develop, the interpretations that we make of our experiences, like what does it mean when I feel lonely in my first year of college? What does it mean that people are going out without me, they didn't consider me? What does it mean when my professor criticizes me? Those meanings can be malleable, we can shift them, but then they can also become fixed with time when they get baked into the structure of people's lives. Yeah. Yeah, there's a... Yeah. No, there are people who think about this very directly, and they think about the different kinds of mentorship, and people need many different kinds of mentorship and many different kinds of supports at different times. I think that one of the things that's important here is that this is not a mentorship program, right? Like we didn't bring our participants in and then assign them to a mentor. The relationships that they developed are much more authentic and sincere than they would be in a formal mentorship program. And there's research that suggests that these kinds of quote-unquote naturally developing mentorship relationships receive more commitment and support from both mentor and mentee. They're better fits. They form spontaneously, but as a function of the treatment that we gave to the students that cleared the psychological obstacle that is the worry about belonging that otherwise prevented them from doing that, right? So there are mentor relationships available to be had. Those are disproportionately not being obtained by students of color in this particular context. And partly that's because of the legacy of stereotypes that creates worries about belonging. But you can address that, and when you can address that and those relationships are available, you can see really significant lasting gains. Okay, let's skip that. I want to illustrate this intervention has been tested in many, many other settings now in many other contexts. I just want to illustrate one example of how it was developed in a STEM context. This was a study looking in particular at the experiences of women in male-dominated engineering fields. This was done at Waterloo. Waterloo is a school where students apply to a given major, and so they enter the university with that major. These are the main collaborators in this project. What we did was we first took a considerable period of time to listen to senior women in engineering about their experiences, and then we adapted content in the intervention to make it fit this context well. One of the themes that we heard from women was that they felt excluded from male peer groups. They didn't feel like they were one of the guys. And we ended up telling a story that validated that concern, but tried to set it aside as not a reason you wouldn't be able to belong in that setting. This was in Canada, so we told a story about hockey. The story said, a woman says, I was talking with these other guys in my program, and they kept talking about hockey. I don't know anything about hockey. I felt really alienated. And then she says, but the conversation turned to a contemporarily popular TV show called Monster Machines. And she said, we had a great time trading conversations about the different episodes. And I realized that even though I don't share their love of hockey, we're all engineers, we're all interested in how things work, and that's why I'm here. And so it acknowledged that it validated the difference, but it didn't allow that difference to mean that she didn't belong in the setting. Another one was that women reported experiencing kind of sexist disrespect in the setting. So students, these female senior students described having created a classy women in engineering calendar and having a male professor make a sexist remark about it, and a female professor tell them that they should present themselves not as women first, but as engineers if they want to be taken seriously. And so we ultimately ended up telling a story in which it was a kind of indirect strategy, but we told a story in which a man described an experience that if he had been a woman could easily have seemed like sexist disrespect. So the man says he was in a class, he cared about the class, he was working hard on the class, but it was hard. He went to talk to the professor, and the professor just blew him off, and it felt like the professor just thought he was dumb. He just says that. But then he says, but then later he realized, he talked to his friends, they all had the same experience, they realized the professor was just a crappy professor, he wasn't good at explaining things, he learned to go to the TA was great, he learned something and he could go with it. The idea there was just to seed in people's minds the possibility that sometimes instances like that might not be sexist disrespect. They might also be something like the professor's not good at explaining things. Here is first year GPA in engineering, the interventions delivered in the first term. And what you see, this is a Canadian grading scale. So this is like honors, and this is like you might get kicked out. And you can see that everybody's doing pretty well in the gender diverse majors. The men are doing pretty well in the male-dominated majors. These are majors that have, on average, about 10% women. So you come into a 20-person class as a woman, and there's like one other woman in that space. Those women who are in those majors in the control condition are not doing very well. The intervention entirely eliminates that gender inequality in first-year grades. We also found that the intervention seemed to support women's development of friendships with peers. So this is a representation in male-dominated majors of women's friendship groups, and you can see that although 90% of their classmates are male engineers, only 44% of their friends are male engineers, and the intervention increases that to about 75%. They're more embedded in the sort of normative social networks that just literally exist within those worlds. They also report hearing, by the way, fewer sexist remarks about women. Okay, so those were both those were both relatively small-scale in-person studies, but we've also done a lot of large-scale institutional-level studies, and this is a figure that just represents the large numbers of people who've come together to form an organization called the College Transition Collaborative, which is a group that has partnered with dozens of institutions around the country to develop and implement and evaluate at scale versions of interventions like these, often delivered online, to try to remedy institution-wide inequalities. In one trial with a belonging intervention delivered in pre-matriculation online processes that all students go through as they enter college, we worked with all of these institutions, funding partners, and lots of technical support to try to scale and deploy these and evaluate their effects at scale. This is a trial with about 45,000 students across 22 different college and university partners. And I'll skip that. I'm going to just keep going to the end because I only have a couple minutes, if that's okay. Do you want to, is that okay? Or? Okay. So I want to highlight one classroom level way to take this idea. This is work from Kevin Binning who's in psychology at Pittsburgh, who collaborated with the teams of faculty who are teaching introductory physics and introductory biology at Pittsburgh. What Kevin did was to randomize classrooms to a belonging intervention In the belonging intervention, these are in session, in like discussion sections early in the term. There's an introduction where all the students hear something like, it can be easy to feel overwhelmed or sometimes wonder if you really belong here. They do independent reflective writing exercise where each student reflects on why that might be true. Then they listen to stories from older students that are designed to highlight that challenges are normal and that they can get better with time. They discuss what they've written in those stories with the people who are on their small 3 to 4 person teams. Then they have a discussion-wide discussion of that, led by the undergraduate teaching assistants. And Kevin and his team implemented this in 2 courses, one of which had seen historic large inequalities by gender, and the other of which had seen historic large inequalities by race ethnicity. And found that in physics, where you had historic inequalities in gender, this approach eliminated that gender inequality in physics grades. The largest gains were observed for women who were lower in self-efficacy, who felt like they couldn't do it. And in biology, where there are historic racial and ethnic inequalities, you see essentially the same pattern where the intervention eliminated the disparity by race ethnicity in first-year grades. Okay, so what does inclusion require? It requires, first, that we anticipate and remedy the kind of toxic cues that exist in settings that signal a narrow or exclusive representation of who belongs, things like Star Trek on the posters on the wall that imply geeky men only need apply. We also need to help people make sense of everyday challenges in ways that are adaptive, that support their belonging, that are adaptive and legitimate in those settings. And we need to make sure that those settings themselves are ones in which those adaptive views are legitimate, where it really is the case that people are able to belong and able, for example, to develop relationships with mentors in those settings. Contexts have to actually afford the possibility to people to belong. The last thing that I want to share, and this will be quicker, is what does this mean for how we think about merit? When I got into psychology, it was through this article that Claude Steele wrote, which I read as a high school student, about the earliest research on what is later called stereotyped threat. This is a figure from one of the earliest stereotyped threat studies. This was a laboratory experiment where black and white Stanford students took a very difficult GRE test that was either described as diagnostic of your intellectual ability or as a series of logical puzzles. And you see that when it's described as diagnostic, you get this large race difference in achievement. But you give people the very same test, and you just call it a test of logical reasoning, and the race difference entirely eliminates. As I thought about it, I realized that the world itself is often the world that's diagnostic. Like often when we take tests, they're understood as being intended to evaluate our ability. Often when we perform in settings, our stereotypes are on the table. So the implication then is that if that's the case, the real world measures that come about from those contexts, like performance on a GRE or performance on an SAT or performance in coursework generally, might be systematically biased. They might systematically underestimate the, as it were, true ability of women in math and science and racial minority students generally. We call it the latent ability hypothesis. The idea is that for people who face negative stereotypes, the real world is like a world with a headwind, where you're running into a constant headwind that makes your performance underestimate the ability that you have. We investigated this through 2 meta-analyses. This is one with laboratory experiments on stereotype threat that took 39 different studies, about 3,000 participants, students who were from groups that were negatively stereotyped or not, very diverse populations. In each study had that characteristic that the Steele and Aronson study had, a threat condition and a safe condition. In each case, people performed on some kind of test. And in each case, there was a measure of performance on a prior index of academic achievement, like people's GRE scores, their SAT scores, their prior grades. What you see is that first, these 2 kinds of performances are positively related. So this is non-stereotype students in the safe conditions, and you see this upward slope. If they had a better score, for example, in the SAT, they do better on the laboratory test of intellectual ability, if it's called that. When threat is heightened in the environment and the purified circumstances of the lab, you can create sort of a large, either powerful, impactful psychological experiences. You see people do less well, even with the same level of prior performance. So if we compare men and women, for example, with the same SAT math score, and how they do on the laboratory test, if they're in the threat condition, the women do less well than the men. The interesting question is, when you take away the threat in the lab, when you make the safe condition, women's performance is going to rise, Black and Hispanics' performance is going to rise, but how is it going to compare to the blue line? And what's most important is that they are actually doing better. At every level of prior performance, women with the same SAT score, SAT math score as men, are doing better. And Black students with the same SAT score or same prior grades as whites are doing better, which suggests that that prior performance systematically underestimated the ability of women, the ability of racial minority students. We replicated this in a second meta-analysis looking at field experiments. And an implication is that people who come from groups that have been disadvantaged have because of that, have really significant unrealized academic potential. And that potential is hidden. It's obscured to us by the influence of negative stereotypes on the performance context that they're in. The bias, as we estimated it, is just under 1/5 of a standard deviation. But that is almost certainly an underestimate because it only reflects the degree to which the laboratory studies are able to actually reduce the threat. Okay, I'll skip that. So what does that mean? It means that if you treat bias measures as valid, you're literally leaving talent on the table. Like, there are people who are more able to do the things that you're going to be asking them to do, insofar as that performance measure has validity, and you're leaving that on the table. We call the remedy here a kind of affirmative meritocracy, and the idea is that when you take that bias into account, you can promote both meritocracy and diversity at the same time in the same way. How exactly you do that can get complicated, but at the least, if you are to treat those measures as face valid, you would be systematically discriminating against people from disadvantaged groups. So it's a big grain of salt for those measures. Okay, I want to just close by just emphasizing this. Our cultures have many mechanisms for reproducing themselves, including reproducing cultures, sort of consequences that are unfair or disadvantage people. And that means that we need to take smart and very intentional efforts to interrupt those problematic processes. We don't have to intend for inequality and disadvantage to persist. It's going to do that all on its own, but we do have to intend and be smart about it and put resources towards and be intentional to create spaces that are more fair and more equitable and that allow people to achieve. Okay, so thank you so much. Sure, yeah. There's one. Yeah. The question is, how can we help men be better allies for women? That's a great question. You're asking a question that's like at the sort of early to mid research, but not yet fully answered stage yet. So there are actually large teams of researchers working on that now. I certainly think that establishing norms about how we treat each other and what is expected is powerful in general. And if we can communicate that clearly about both interpersonal behaviors and interactions and in more sort of institutional context, that's valuable. It's not so helpful to tell people like, don't be racist or don't be sexist. If people have the view that you're either racist, there's actually a fixed mindset you can have about racism. So if you have the view that racism is fixed, then white people actually act in prejudiced ways with black people. Like they're avoidant and they try to avoid those conversations, and they look awkward in ways that come off itself as prejudice. So it's important not to sort of put a kind of fixed box around people and label them as bad. I do think that there are, we did one study in middle school looking at teachers' mindsets. We had done a lot of research on racial bias that exists in school discipline processes, where it's very easy for teachers to see kids, particularly minority kids, as troublemakers when they act out, and to see them as troublemakers more quickly if they're minority kids than if they're non-minority kids. And we did an intervention we called an empathic discipline intervention, where we talked with teachers about how to have a empathic approach to kids when they misbehave, and we asked them how they do that themselves. And that halved the suspension rate for kids in their classes. Kids whose math teacher got the treatment versus control were half as likely to get suspended over the school year. A really important lesson of that is that I think it's going to be far, far, far more effective if you represent to people the positive self that they could be or could become, and imply that that's who they already are, and ask them to realize that, rather than telling them that they're bad and they shouldn't be bad. Like, it's far better to invite people to be their best self than to punitively respond to them about their worst self. Okay? That can be very frustrating, because I think sometimes when we've experienced bias in settings, we want to call that out. We want to say people are biased and bad, and that may well be true. But I don't think that people respond well to that. Yeah, I think that I think it's a choice that an institution makes about how to represent that history. And if the history is literally just put up as, here are all the people and they all have this identity, and it's unproblematized, then that creates a threat for people. You can certainly say, who are we as an institution, and what kind of place have we been? And the history of this field, the history of this kind of institution is often like this. We share in that history. We have had parts of that history. That's not how we identify ourselves now. That's not who we want to become in the future. Here are the models of the kinds of people that we value and that we want to become more of. You can take people that are in the past. You can take people in the present, and you can make them more visible in those spaces to represent the current identity and future trajectory of the place. So there's no law that says you have to put every white male board member of the organization that's ever been up on the wall, right? That's not required. And even if you had that, you can problematize that and talk about what your identity is now, who it is that you want to become, and the kinds of people that you want to represent. Mm-hmm. Well, we can estimate the effect. Yeah, I mean, our effect size estimate here, if you just take that as an effect size estimate, has these kinds of implications for interpreting an SAT score. But the effect is going to vary considerably, and if you do start to go down the road of kind of formal corrections, then there's going to be all sorts of political and legal fights that you'll have. I think the easier place to land is to say that we need to take these measures, we need to be aware of this bias in general, and we need to take these kinds of measures with a giant grain of salt as a consequence of them, knowing that they're going to vary, knowing that the degree of bias will vary, and it will vary with the degree to which environments are threatening. Yeah, you should. That's our affirmative meritocracy paper. There's a separate paper that the third author here led. That's a law review article. This is a policy paper, and you can look at that to see how we thought about that. This article is going to talk more about the idea of corrections and how that might sit politically from an empirical social science perspective, from a political perspective, and from a legal perspective. It is really hard to get traction on that argument, though. But we need to be aware of that bias. Yeah, the answer is no. We've done belonging interventions with institutions that are very well resourced and very poorly resourced, and we found positive effects in both kinds of institutions. What we do see, though, is that the treatment, and this is from this large CTC belonging trial where we have 22 different institutions, and we have the experiences of people as a function of their race and their gender group in the institution in a given cohort across 365 what we call local identity groups then, like people like me in my context at my time. And we're using that to understand essentially heterogeneity, like where do you see effects and where do you not see effects. And the upshot is that for the kinds of groups that we're concerned about, the historically poorly performing groups, you get larger effects in contexts that afford the possibility that you belong. That is, in contexts where in the control condition, absent treatment, people like you report at the end of the first year relatively higher levels of achieved belonging. That is, in context where the belonging message is more true. And that's why I emphasize it's really important that the context actually afford belonging. Like if you give people the belonging message, but actually they can't belong because people are racist and they're not going to be friends with you and they're not going to be mentors to you, well, that's no good. That trial came about because there was a New York Times Magazine story about our work that got a lot of press in higher education. And so institutions came calling to us, and 85% of the funding for that trial came from institutional partners themselves. They paid significant amounts of money to make that trial happen. So there was buy-in from the upper leadership of all of our institutional partners. The trial itself, though, is relatively easy for institutions to implement in a way that compromises the impact of the treatment as compared to what it could be. That is, it's delivered in online mod. So every school, every four-year school has an online system just about in which they have students do things like upload a picture for their ID card or upload health insurance information. And we were able to create an online module including our belonging treatment on a randomized basis within the systems for all of those schools. And so from an implementation perspective for all of our partners, it's relatively easy. Now, that means, though, that the experience for a student is far less impactful than it would be were it to be delivered in a variety of other kinds of ways that institutions who have been inspired this work have pursued and done, including, for example, the ecological belonging intervention that's been done at Pittsburgh. Stanford has programs, it's called Frosh 101, where there are dorm discussion groups that surface the normativeness of concerns about belonging and provide the safe spaces in which people can articulate that and share that and come to be acquainted with that. There's lots of other different things that people can do, like the ways in which deans give speeches to incoming students that represent what this place is going to be like, videos that schools send to incoming students representing what this place is going to be like. It's all that kind of network of reinforcing messages that ultimately produces the kinds of large impacts that we want. So it's a complicated answer, and that requires like significant institutional buy-in and coordination. Thank you.